Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to open this Transatlantic Bridge Conference for 2024. And against all academic traditions, we are starting 1 minute ahead of time, which is quite remarkable, I think. That shows, I think, the interest of all participants in the discussions that we have on our menu. But let me first, in my capacity as Rector of SAIS Europe, welcome you warmly in Bologna. It's really a great pleasure for all of us to have you here and to join the powerful team that has given life to this multi-annual exercise. As you know, the event is organized by 4 top schools, SAIS at Johns Hopkins, IE, School of Politics, Economics, and Global Affairs, Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs, and PSIA at Sciences Po, a very powerful lineup of schools of international affairs. And we have in common, of course, a vision in which we sense the need for continuous discussion on a number of issues that are of great relevance to the transatlantic partnership. I'm not going to lecture you on this. That's not the purpose of an introduction. I simply want to say that I think very few people would dispute that all the topics that we are going to discuss in these 48 hours are of extreme relevance for all the Atlantic partners, and that the list of hot issues is only growing. Hence, in our view, the necessity for not occasional discussions, but a systematic analysis and intellectual confrontation that will gradually lead us to a point where we hopefully will be in a situation better to understand what's going on and perhaps to disseminate ideas to the publics with whom we are engaged in a dialogue. On top of all that, of course, this year's conference comes at what one could define as a critical juncture, namely in a year of elections. And in our populist times, we know that elections often bring surprises and significant changes that, of course, may have an impact over the international posture of multiple actors. We've just had the European elections. I can't say that overall the outcome is terribly surprising, but they have triggered all sorts of dynamics in a number of countries, which, yes, could indeed have remarkable consequences. I'm sure that this is something that will come up in our discussions. And needless to say, probably you could say as much, and that's all I will say about it, about the American election, which indeed is bound to be rich in consequences for the transatlantic partnership. So what I want to insist on before passing the floor to the panelists is that for us at SAIS Europe, this is really a formidable opportunity. You may not know it, but this place, SAIS Bologna Center, was created almost 70 years ago by a professor of diplomatic history from SAIS, Seagrove Haynes, who came as early as the early 1950s to the conclusion that it was really indispensable to have structures in which young Americans, and young Europeans coached by faculty from both sides of the Atlantic could discuss matters of common interest. That's not less relevant today than it was then. Perhaps we should add to this a little footnote, which is that it is equally important to discuss with people from other regions of the world. But the point is that for us, an event like this weekend's event, is really a remarkable opportunity to simply stay faithful to our initial mission. We, as you may have heard, have ambitious plans. We want to develop activities. We want to bring more people to Bologna. All that is true, but this is not something that we will do on our own, because if there's one thing that we know well, it is that for all our activities, be they teaching activities or research activities, a critical element is the quality of the partnerships that we may build. So I'm very happy tonight to be given the opportunity to say that the partnership in this small consortium is for us really an important element, a way to achieve some of our key objectives. And I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to the colleagues from all four organizing institutions that have been active in designing the program and building the set for the discussions we will now have. I will stop here. I mean, you're not here to listen to lengthy introductions, and I think it's appropriate for me simply to say thank you to the organizing committee. Thank you to our guests who have accepted to travel from distant places in order to be with us over these 2 days. We very much look forward to the discussions that will start right now, and I therefore pass the floor over to Luce for the first panel of this conference. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Renaud. That was a kind introduction. It's great to be here, particularly in Bologna at this time of year. It's just the air is soft and life is good. It's also a very relevant time of year, a very relevant time to be discussing this topic, travel across the pond. Unfortunately, relevant, super relevant, given the time in the electoral calendar in various democracies. Matthias said the other day, quite rightly, that the three, I don't think he said democracies, but the three original sort of nation-state political systems, namely America, France, and Britain, presidential, semi-presidential, parliamentary, are all at very key inflection points. We've got, of course, the French snap election. We've got a British July 4th election, which is just a perfect day, you know, American independence day. And of course, we've got the mother of all elections in November, on the November the 5th. So I'm going to break protocol here. I'll introduce each panelist as I talk to them by asking my first question to the one white male on the audience. As I would not normally do this.
Don't worry.
But I will make up for it, Constanze and Nathalie, I promise. Because your election, as in Britain's election, is the first result. France has its first round on June the 30th, but it doesn't complete till June the 7th, if indeed the calendar sticks to what it is, which it might not, apparently. Britain, July 4th election. So you were in Parliament. Rory Stewart's probably known to all of you, was a British Conservative Member of Parliament from 2010 to 2019, was the only Conservative who ran for the leadership in 2019, promising to kind of reverse Brexit, right? Well, kind of, I mean, with nuance. And the only one who promised not to serve in Boris Johnson's government if Boris Johnson One, and you were true to your word, you resigned from politics in 2019, and you're now, I had to do a double take. You're at Yale, and you're in the Brady-Johnson chair, right? Not the Boris Johnson chair. I sort of had to read that twice. And as many of you who listen to podcasts know, that Rory's joint podcast with Alistair Campbell of Tony Blair fame, one of the great, sort of the James Carville of Britain, really. The Rest is Politics. Their podcast is, I think, the most listened to politics podcast in Britain, and maybe even broader categories than that. So, Rory, let me ask you this. As I said, the calendar is perfect for this conversation. And by the way, I forgot to mention today is the 78th birthday of Donald Trump. And I'm sure you'll all join me in wishing him many happy returns. But we've got an incredible full circle situation with Britain, because arguably the right-wing populist phase began in June 2016 with Brexit. And now we have an election, the least troubling of those three for a change, in which we've gone really full circle from Brexit to, dare I say it, regrets it. Talk to us a little bit about the election, what you think is going to happen, and whether there's a larger sort of morality tale in populism, in buyer's remorse, as it were, in populism sort of burning itself out. And I know that Nigel Farage is running. I know it's not all simple. But tell us a little bit about that in that slightly broader context.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. So firstly, basic structure of what Ed said is correct. The UK has gone from a position where in the 2019 election, for example, we had Boris Johnson, who was very much creating a kind of Trumpian political base and was challenging the Supreme Court, trying to prorogue Parliament, running against Jeremy Corbyn, who, for those of you who can remember that far back, is a sort of Bernie Sanders-esque figure, more concerned actually with Palestine really than anything to do with Britain, but very, very much a figure of the left, a rebellious figure of the left. And now we find ourselves in an election in which, instead of these figures from the populist left and right, we have a rather dull banker against a rather dull lawyer. And despite the best attempts of Rishi Sunak to portray Keir Starmer as a proto-communist, and despite Keir Starmer's best attempts to persuade us that Rishi Sunak is a far-right populist, basically it's almost impossible to get a cigarette paper between them. Now, there is therefore something possibly quite encouraging. So François Hollande, for example, has said that Britain has passed peak populism. But there is a potential danger after the election. There is no doubt that Labour will win that election. They've been 20 points ahead in the polls for nearly 18 months now. But they are choosing a very peculiar strategy. Labour is choosing to run really as a sort of tribute act to Tony Blair and David Cameron. I mean, they're running as centrists of the late 90s, early 2000s. They are socially liberal and they are fiscally very conservative. This is a very particular centrist model, which is not, to put it mildly, very popular across the world and carries with it some risks. They are going into an election in which they have promised to respect £18 billion worth of conservative spending cuts, have promised not to raise income tax, VAT, corporation tax or national insurance, so they've ruled out 85% of the revenue sources available to them. They have promised not to borrow, so they've said that they are going to stick to a fiscal rule where debt will reduce as a proportion of GDP within 5 years. In other words, they've signed up basically to austerity. And of course, they have a voter base that is trying to kick out conservatives who for 14 years are characterized, sometimes unfairly, but broadly speaking, as an austerity government. at a time when people feel that inequality is dramatic, the National Health Service is flailing, education doesn't have proper investment, we haven't got any infrastructure, and there is huge popular demand for big industrial strategy, right? A lot of fantasies about being able to emulate Biden, but Labour has got rid of their industrial strategy, given up on their £28 billion commitment to green growth, and has no money with which to play industrial strategy. At the same time, they are refusing to do anything to reverse Brexit. One of the most depressing things about this election is that none of the major parties are prepared to countenance even rejoining the customs union, let alone the single market. So there are many intermediate phases that you could do, short of rejoining the European Union, right? Britain probably could bring some confidence back to its economy by simply rejoining the customs union, but Labour's not prepared to do that. Instead, they're retaining what was a fantasy of 2016, which is a free trade fantasy in a world that is increasingly protectionist. A free trade fantasy at a moment at which the United States is announcing 103% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, Europe is announcing over 30% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and where there is very little appetite for open global free trade. So what I fear, to cut to the end of my little intervention, is that they are setting up the potential for a populist resurgence. They are creating huge room for a socially conservative, more economically interventionist party to emerge. You can see that Nigel Farage in the YouGov poll today is now, for the first time, ahead of the Conservative Party. This is an anti-immigration, climate skeptic party that emerged from the Brexit Party. Now, because of our first-past-the-post system, it doesn't mean that they're likely to get any more than one seat in Parliament. I mean, they could well get, 18% of the vote and only get one seat in Parliament. But it is going to mean that the Conservatives will be very, very tempted to lurch hard to the right. They're going to learn the wrong lessons from their defeat. Instead of consolidating in the centre, they're going to chase the sort of Farage right-wing vote, and Britain will then face a very strong right-wing populist challenge after the election, I fear.
I'm just quickly going to follow up on that, Rory. 8 years ago, when the Brexit referendum was held, partly was on about immigration, partly was about increasing British spending on the NHS, £350 million a week extra, and taking back control. On each count, the opposite has happened. Immigration's doubled. NHS has been cut. It's the most austere, stringent public health situation in living memory. And taking back control, well, there was a misunderstanding of sovereignty versus power, as you could way better explain than me. But just to push you on the original question that I asked you, in 2019, Boris Johnson ran on the slogan of "Get Brexit Done." 2024, the Conservatives are not mentioning the word. That's an extraordinary change. And notwithstanding your very, very well-grounded criticisms of Labour's incredibly conservative, risk-averse manifesto and the populist consequences that could flow from that, the fact that the Tories go from saying "get it done" to not mentioning it, it never happened, is an extraordinary change, isn't it? Is there a larger sort of lesson for other democracies, or are all democracies uniquely unhappy Tolstoy families?
Well, I think there are many lessons. It's certainly true that there is a lot of buyer's remorse in Britain. Right? Polls suggest that well over 60% of people think that Brexit has harmed the economy. However, unfortunately, there are two problems. Very few voters put a second referendum high on their list of priorities. So they regret leaving the European Union, but there's very little appetite for refighting that referendum. Secondly, the key battleground for Labour, the votes that Labour wants to win, are in the old post-industrial areas, the northeast, which predominantly voted Brexit. This was what was called in the 2019 election the Red Wall. These are old Labour seats that went Conservative. And to win those voters back, they are not talking about Brexit at all. And as I say, the Labour manifesto rules out even contemplating the customs union or the single market, let alone moving at all on this issue. The lesson, I think, for broader democracies from Britain is probably threefold, and then I'll be quiet. I mean, one of them is that we live in incredibly polarizing environments, and I think a lot of that is actually about social media, the way that Twitter and X and Facebook operate. And, you know, the Brexit referendum was astonishing. We found ourselves in a world in which 50% of people who voted Remain in 2016 said they wouldn't contemplate speaking to somebody who voted Brexit. And 25% said that they wouldn't contemplate their child marrying someone who'd voted the other way, and vice versa, right? It's not quite as bad as the US, right? It is possible in Britain to make an argument for the centre ground. I made the mistake at New York University for making an impassioned speech for the centre ground, and all my liberal friends saying to me, screw the centre ground, we want to kill these guys, we're not interested in moderation and compromise in centre ground at all. Nevertheless, I think the fundamental problem that we're all struggling with, the US slightly less, but most European countries, is the structures of our economies are very difficult. Our demography is very difficult. It's very difficult to find where our competitive advantage lies. It's very difficult to see where our industrial strategies are going to take us. It's very difficult to see in the long term how we're going to support our welfare states, our health systems, our pension systems, or generate the kind of growth that our voters want. And I think the final thing is finish with a vision of that extraordinary lineup of leaders, G7. The astonishing unpopularity of all of those people. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, Olaf Scholz and Rishi Sunak, you know, are down at sort of -53, -60. But even Justin Trudeau and Macron are in terrible situations. They're right down in the -30s. Fumio Kishida's in the -40s. You know, in this context, you know, Biden's net popularity looks strong, and the only person who's coming out on top is Giorgia Meloni, right? This is a very, very worrying world for people like me who want to assert the centre ground, technocratic government. This is a world that's changing, and I think Britain maybe isn't bucking the trend as much as Ed wants. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. But I'm just asking questions. Constanze, I mean, we're going to get to Meloni being the least unpopular G7 leader in a moment, and Nathalie. But Constanze, let me just turn to you because, and you can both talk about France, I know, but I want just to focus on the French elections, this extraordinary gamble. Now, Constanze Stelzenmüller is in charge of Europe and international at Brookings. I've got the title wrong. She's a monthly contributor to my newspaper, the Financial Times, formerly in the German media, an expert as well, not just on transatlantic relations, but on human rights and international law. So a good person to have, a great person to have. Okay, I will tamp it down. Let me just ask you about the French elections. I mean, Macron made a huge gamble, and since that gamble, after the European elections, of course, context being they weren't quite as bad as some members of my profession, the European elections presented. It wasn't an across-the-board right-wing surge. There were right-wing surges in France. Meloni did well. The Brothers of Italy did well in Italy. The Freedom Party did well in Austria, but Spain, they did badly. Poland, again, badly. It's a more variegated picture, but the two sort of anchors of Europe, Germany and France, the ruling parties did really badly, and that's, if nothing else, bad news for European coherence and decision-making. Both governments are going to be looking inward. Let's just start with Macron. He called immediately a snap French parliamentary election, and it seems to be blowing up in his face. If on July the 7th we have the right winning but needing to, you know, have the far right in government, if we end up with a cohabitation with Macron as president and the Rassemblement, Le Pen's Rassemblement in government, somebody like Jordan Bardella as prime minister, is that, following the 8-year Brexit story, good in terms of, well, give them enough rope to hang themselves? or is this just going to make the last 3 years of Macron look so hapless that it'll set up Le Pen to become president of France in 2027? How do you see what looks like a bad gamble panning out?
Well, it's always tricky to, as a person of the German persuasion, to talk about our French neighbours on a panel, especially if you've got French friends sitting in the audience. By the way, I do want to say thank you to SAIS for inviting us here. This is lovely. I do feel that this looks a little bit like a PhD panel, and we're going to have to test you during the reception, or fail you. As you can see, I'm stalling. Look, I'm still digesting, frankly, what happened in France since Sunday. It's been the most astounding rout, right, of across the board, really, and breakup and reformation of a national party system in Europe that I have ever seen, right? Who would have thought that the French left would be able to find itself in a new Front Populaire and underneath the appealing Mr. Mélenchon yet? And that you would have the sort of farcical drama that you had with Les Républicains and, people locking each other out of offices and that kind of thing. French Twitter on Monday and Tuesday was a marvel to behold, right? French X. I know that what you just laid out, right? The giving them rope to hang themselves for 3 years is what sort of kind souls are trying to, the rationale that kinder interpreters are trying to attribute to Macron, right? I fear that this is all happening at a time when the cost of that path, even if that should be true, the cost of that path would be such, not just for France, but for Europe and in fact for NATO, that I think the risk of that going badly for the French, for Europe, and for NATO is extremely high. And again, that sort of then throws the spotlight over to Berlin, where you then particularly want stability. And right now, this is the stability of the damned, right? That's pretty much what I've got to say about France. Look, it feels, frankly, as somebody who had a lot of French classes inflicted on her and French history, it does seem like one of these moments, right, when somebody is going to refound the Republic, and give it a new, numeral, because I don't see how this goes on, right? It seems like a moment of such destruction that you would hope that something creative comes out of it, but right now it looks pretty dismal. And frankly, the last thing I'm going to believe is that Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella are, sort of civilized hard right, who are pro-NATO, pro-Europe. I don't believe that for a word. The German expression for this phenomenon is der ein Wolf der Kreide gefressen hat, the wolf who has eaten chalk. Right, to change their voice. I think that in power we would see them unleashed, right? And I think that this would be an extremely unhappy form of cohabitation. Maybe somebody would like to disagree with us or me afterwards, but that's my fear.
No, that sounds calm and placid enough. Natalie, I am going to ask you about Meloni, but let's just ask you about France, since you're a close neighbor. Now, Nathalie Tocci is head of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, the leading think tank, foreign policy think tank in Rome, and is involved with any institution, university, or think tank across the continent with Europe in its name. That's my sort of short summary of Nathalie's very impressive resume. And slightly more notoriously, like me, studied PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University. And those who know Britain know that degree has a lot to answer for at the moment. So we're going to try, you are going to try and redeem that particular degree. But let me just stick with France, because the Italian results are important, and I'll ask you about that next. But do you share Constanze's pretty sort of epic tectonic description of what we're on the cusp of in France?
Well, actually, I do, and the reason why I do is precisely because of an Italian connection there in the logic. So, as you, Ed, you put it, well, the gamble is given, assuming that the first gamble doesn't pay off, then the question is the second gamble. And so having a cohabitation, essentially eroding that consent of Le Pen and Bardella, and therefore all will be fine in 3 years' time. Now, I think the snag in that argument is that what will happen or what could happen in the next 3 years, were that scenario to come about, is something not very different from what happened in Italy. There is a normalization of the hard right. There's an institutionalization of the hard right. You will then have something which is even further to the right, which will make them look more civilized. And there is no such thing as a civilized hard right. I mean, there is a difference between a smart hard right and a stupid hard right. You can certainly, especially if you think about this country, make that kind of distinction. But the smart hard right is far more dangerous. And the smart hard right plays it gradually. Now, it could be that, again, to make a comparison between Italy and France, that in the Italian case, there is more of a structural necessity to play it slowly, because, for instance, our economy is far more fragile, and perhaps this may sound a little bit unpatriotic, but our weak economy, meaning our huge debt, is actually a source of strength because there's a far greater risk in doing something stupid. In the case of France, of course, France does have its economic fragilities, but not quite the same as Italy, and so there may be more of the temptation to play with fire sooner. But it could be that indeed, if the Bardella-Le Pen couple is a smart one, and tragically it looks like they're not stupid, they may indeed go that Italian route. And so I'm not so sure that the rope to hang on is actually going to play out as a scenario. So yes, I would tend to, I mean, of course, who knows? And then hopefully we're both wrong. But I would tend to be more on Constanze's line.
That Macron really is a clueless gambler at this point.
I mean, it could be, it could be, Luce, that the argument could be what was the alternative, right? And there was no good alternative.
Okay, so let me just ask you about Meloni, though, because as Rory pointed out, Meloni is the G7 leader who's done well out of the European elections. Her Brothers of Italy party and some sister allied parties are now much stronger. She's got more leverage over whether Ursula von der Leyen gets another 5-year term as the European president, and picks for all the big commissioner jobs. Now, put very crudely, from Washington, there's only really been one benchmark of whether Meloni is like a nasty populist or a populist we can work with, and that is, is Italy behaving on Ukraine? To which the answer is yes, Italy has surprised on the upside, and therefore we haven't really paid much attention to some of the social immigration policies that she's been pursuing. Is she going to become more like we thought she was? Or is she already like that and the non-Italians are just not paying enough attention?
She has always been like that, and now she is gradually revealing that she is like that, including actually on Ukraine. Let's take, rewind back a month ago, the whole sort of debate on whether Western weapons to Ukraine could be used on Russian territory. This has been in the pipeline for some time, and then eventually, actually spurred by France in many respects, the US decided to move ahead, Germany decided to move ahead. There's only actually one big NATO ally that did not, and that is Italy. Now, had that decision standing out against essentially the majority in NATO, had that decision been taken by Meloni a year ago, well, alarm bells probably would have gone off. The point is that she has had a year to basically fool everyone. Yeah? And now that she has done, I mean, remember, the kiss on the forehead, Biden's kiss on the forehead. Now that she has done so, she can gradually, and as I'm saying, there's a difference, it's not civilized, it's between a smart and a stupid hard right. You can gradually lower that mask. And I think that is the trend. Take, for instance, another example, you were mentioning social issues, abortion. I doubt that had Italy presided over the G7 a year ago, Meloni would have dared to try and erase a reference to abortion rights in a G7 communique, right? Why is she doing it now? Because she obviously feels that she can. She feels that she's stronger. But her beliefs on abortion have always been the same, right? So I think there's a question of confidence and time and gradualism. And so I think the direction of travel is not towards the center, it's towards the right. Now, of course, and this comes to the European story, in some respects, the moment of reckoning is going to be over the European top jobs. I'm assuming, I mean, let's see what happens. I'm assuming that she will probably give a go-ahead in the European Council. She can't, von der Leyen is, I wouldn't say a done deal, but in the Council, it's as close as it gets to a done deal. However, why should she split her group in the European Parliament and have only parliamentarians from her own party support von der Leyen, when actually, and this goes to the results of the European elections, tragic as they were in France and in Germany, the truth is that actually the hard right did not do at EU level, as well as many feared. And so even if she were to support, I'm assuming that the Greens will eventually back von der Leyen, even if she were to back von der Leyen, her votes will not be instrumental. So again, why not be true to yourself, especially if you think that the wind is turning right? And of course, the big question is what happens in France, that we've been discussing. So I think, as I said, the jury's still out, but my bet would be that she would move rightwards.
But in a moment, I'm going to get on to, this is transatlantic. Are you okay? Oh dear. I'll save some good questions. Are you all right? Okay. So I'm going to get on to Trump in a moment. This is transatlantic, this discussion, but let me just press you one more question, Nathalie. I mean, Le Pen used to be anti-Europe. She's now not going to pull out of the EU. Is that a fake? Do our original beliefs still hold? I mean, it's quite interesting to me that Bruno Le Maire, the French economy minister, said the French right will bring in Liz Truss economics. And he didn't even have to explain what that meant. We know that's a code for catastrophe. Isn't that the sign of the French right adapting to what is not just electability, but political reality, that you would fail as a government if you pull out of the largest market in the world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that doesn't, to me, that is not a sign necessarily of moderation. That's a sign of, in some respects, adaptation as a consequence of intelligence, right? So given that Brexit was such an unmitigated disaster, the hard right is not so stupid necessarily as to go down that route. And so in a sense, the project is far more insidious, it's far more poisonous. I remember actually in Paris a few years ago, I was kind of talking with students in Sorbonne, and a student asked me, can a fascist European Union exist? And I said, well, a fascist Europe can exist, it has existed, it could exist, right? A fascist European Union is a contradiction in terms. And so the project that these movements have of corroding the project from within is in some respects far more dangerous. If you want to leave. Okay, dramatic, it was dramatic, yeah, but the Union survived. The Union cannot survive an erosion of its fundamental values.
Okay, I'm going to move on to America, but I mean, underlying this all, I want to sort of get to what's driving populism across the democratic West. We're confined to the West. If we weren't, we'd be talking about the Indian recent elections, but I'm sure that will come up during this conference because they are very significant. But Trump yesterday went back to the scene of the crime, as it were, to Capitol Hill for the first time since January the 6th, 2021, where his party all but sort of anointed him with holy oil and kissed his feet. I mean, it was an extraordinary act of unity and obeisance behind Trump. And if we think of the story of European fascism, Daniel Ziblatt, the great scholar on democracy, often makes the analogy between February 6th, 1934, the attacks on the French Assembly by veterans of the Great War, of hard right collection of fringe groups, and February 6th veterans, the February Sixers, then formed the basis of the Vichy government after 1940. It became a badge of pride. One of the reasons that I am a little bit less worried about Europe than the United States is nowhere in Europe is one of the two main parties subscribed to the January 6th, to a litmus test, an oath of loyalty that says the last election was fake. We reject the legitimacy of the last election. Nowhere in Europe has reached that point, let alone a 50-50 chance of being re-elected. And not just to the January 6th oath, there's now a new one, which is the conviction of Trump on 34 counts in a New York court has to be rejected. The due process of law has to be rejected. Rory, isn't this a scale of threat completely in its own category compared to what we've just been discussing on this side of the Atlantic? And Constanze, obviously, I hope you're okay.
I think there's no doubt at all that the election that is going to be most consequential for the world is the Biden-Trump election. And it has huge implications. It has huge implications, obviously, for Russia-Ukraine. It has implications for China-Taiwan. It probably also has implications for the global trading system, because I imagine that he will become more protectionist. It has implications for whether or not there is a US-led international urge to get involved in holding democratic standards or human rights elsewhere. So, I would imagine that the world that we're still just about in a world in which if there's a problem in Eastern DRC, it's the US who naturally would go out there. If there's a problem in Sudan, for better or for worse, the US is expected to do something. It's the US who turns up in Israel, Gaza, not China, right? So there is still a sense that the US is trying occasionally to continue to play some of the roles that they would have played in the 90s, early 2000s. But the election of a Trump administration, I think, would see a radical change in attitudes to liberal democracy, attitudes to free trade, and attitudes towards international security. However, just to sort of reinforce some of the gloominess from Europe, so far what we've seen in Europe has been relatively isolated countries. We look at Hungary, we look at Poland, and then thank goodness Poland has moved back, and now we're looking at Italy. But I think there is a sense that if you get 2 or 3 more major countries flipping in this direction, there is a potential snowball momentum effect. And that's, of course, what Orban fantasized about. Orban's vision of the world is a vision of Erdogan, Modi, Trump, Putin, Meloni, Le Pen, and then the rise of the AfD in Germany, changes in Austria. Suddenly, then, you are in a very, very different world. It's a world that doesn't really feel like anything that we've seen for many, many decades.
Okay, Constanze, probably, and many people here know what I think of Trump and what this election represents, but let me play the devil's advocate here. Let's say Trump is elected. And let's look at, I'm taking from Rory's answer, look at the impact beyond America's borders. Well, here in Europe, the first sort of line you draw from a Trump re-election is to Ukraine. In which he said, I'll fix it on day one, which essentially means I'll pull the plug from Zelensky's government and force Ukraine to come to terms on an unlevel playing field with Putin. I'm not sure a re-elected Biden would be that dramatically different. I think that an off-ramp would be far more elegantly and collectively negotiated, but I don't think there's a Biden term 2 appetite for a long war in Ukraine. So I'm playing devil's advocate here. But would there be a dramatic difference between Trump and a visibly, painfully aging Biden in his second term for Europe?
Well, I'm glad you dealt with Germany while I was outside, clearly.
We will come back to Germany, I promise you.
But I think it depends on the issue. I think, somewhat paradoxically, in terms of economic policy, the Biden agenda is not that far away from the Trump agenda, right? In terms of protectionism, right? And so there, I think there would be less of a tangible change. I think in most other areas, though, the change would be massive, immediate, and really quite dramatic. Which is not to gainsay or contradict you when you say that a Biden agenda in the second term would also to be nudging Ukraine towards some form of accommodation. I feel that's true. I do think that it is less likely, though, because for the simple reason that I see Putin as tied up in a logic of war. I don't think that there is a viable choice of peace for Putin.
What would be the impact of Trump being elected on the AfD, or indeed the Brothers of Italy, on the far right, and on what Rory said was Orban's fantasy, quite rightly, I think? Would it be a rocket boost for that?
Well,
and talk about Germany, because we haven't got into the consequences.
Let me perhaps say something about the Trumpian program, though, because I'm a lawyer by training, a constitutional lawyer, and I'm a German, and so certain things, I watch very carefully. And I also, for what it's worth, did back in the day, a German PhD about American constitutional law. So I have a sort of sense of deep affinity for the American constitutional order and the sort of truly remarkable creation that is America's 18th century constitution. And I think it needs to be clear to everyone, if it isn't already, that what the MAGA right is proposing is a reformulation of the American constitutional order along the lines of Hungary, of Orban's Hungary. In other words, the suspension of the checks and balances, the unity of church and state, so the end of disestablishment, and I would say sharp reductions in civil rights and liberties. I have spent a lot of time, sadly, reading the literature of the American hard right ever since 2016, and it's not pleasant, but it is very serious. And truth be told, the American hard right don't spend that much time thinking about foreign and security policy. Not really their brief. Also, they're not the kind of people who write policy papers. There are some emanations of a lesser order out there, like the famous Dormant NATO paper by Samantha Maitre, right, which I think is basically an application form for a job in the National Security Council. But I think an America that tried to immediately sack all political appointees, and more than that, that immediately said our best friends are now Viktor Orban and everybody, every other country that's run by a hard right authoritarian, would that have an impact on foreign and security policy? It very obviously would. And of course, pressure would be brought to bear on Ukraine. Of course, it would be defunded and so on. I think that's what we have to assume. Now, on your much more cheerful question of the AfD. So I wrote a Brookings blog on Monday on what had happened in Germany. I mean, it's as pretty much everywhere else. It's sort of a double-sided picture. On the one hand, the strength of German centrist conservatives who, quote unquote strength, who came out at pretty much 30%, which is what they'd had before, helps solidify the centrist coalition at the European level. That's not a bad thing. But the coalition government and its three component parties were trounced, and the AfD and the new left-wing party, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, are the true winners. Right? They're the ones whose vote share really, really exploded. I mean, the Wagenknecht Alliance is still at 6%, but they started at nothing in January, which is very unusual by German standards. And the real losers are the Greens, who lost a stunning 8.6%. Right? And I think it has to be said that the traffic light parties in Germany have only themselves to blame for this. Right? And this is not an achievement of the opposition. They have themselves to blame for basically having failed at sort of quite core tasks of governance, right? And it's my personal conviction that we are not paying enough attention to. We keep being distracted by the culture war sort of mirages that the hard right sort of tries to deploy in front of us, or by the theory of economic inequality. Both those things exist. They have a certain polling power in certain milieus, but I think what's really off-putting for the average voter is to see centrist parties, centrist governments failing at basic jobs of governance, at failing to provide public goods, right? Failing to solve problems. That is what really gives the hard right traction, right? And everything else, especially exploitation of this by sort of foreign authoritarians, is just exploiting vulnerabilities that we and they have created, right? Now, granted, these are difficult problems to resolve today, but still, some of the mistakes that the government made were positively amateurish. Yeah? So the punishment is deserved. I mean, most people are focusing now on the fact that the government is still hanging in there, and yes, it is very difficult in Germany to have snap elections, as opposed to France and Great Britain. But we've got a budget decision coming in 4 weeks, and that will be a very sharp survival test of the coalition. I would say it's 50-50.
I mean, what you're describing is roughly what Rory was predicting will be the result of a Labour government that doesn't provide public goods, which is rather depressing, but it makes sense. Nathalie, just very simply, the Trump effect on Maloney, it would help in the unleashing of the true Maloney and allied parties across the
Yes. So I would say that for someone like Meloni, the reason why she has taken a very firm line on Ukraine has very little to do with Ukraine. It has all to do with the transatlantic relationship. And she needed to, sort of work on her reputation. I mean, given the fear of, the fascists are coming. And so what best way to do it other than, Ukraine? So it was all about the transatlantic relationship. If Washington were to throw Kyiv under the bus, and it would to do so in the name of peace, yeah, what would prevent her from tagging along? So I think, this connects to this kind of wider question of what is the danger that Trump represents for Europe. So it represents a danger, first and foremost, for liberal democracy in Europe, precisely because of the fragilities in liberal democracy in Europe that we've been talking about, and because indeed it would allow the smart hard right to lower their mask. It represents a threat to Europe because of the divisions that it would ignite. In this respect, there's a difference between Trump 1.0 and 2.0 because the context in Europe has changed. So Trump, and of course, when Trump, 2016, there was a problem of nationalist populism in Europe back then as well. But back then, there was this cohesive effect that Trump had on Europe, in which it was Angela Merkel who was the leader of the free world, yeah? As the US had temporarily checked out of that liberal international order, Europe united, especially after Brexit, in which we really did need to stick together, stood up. I doubt that would be the effect on Europe. I think it would be far more divisive, precisely because of the fragilities that we've been talking about. And if I may, Ed, to answer the question that you asked Constanze earlier, the provocative question, does it actually make a difference given that, Biden may not, may actually want to push Ukraine into a solution? Yes, it's clear that that is the direction of travel. However, one thing is to push for eventually a solution which means that Ukraine doesn't recognize, borders and a change of borders, but it temporarily accepts that it doesn't retake control over the whole lot. But though fundamentally, Kiev remains politically independent and integrating in the EU and getting closer to NATO. I don't think that is the Trump deal. I think that and fundamentally, what Putin doesn't really care about territory. Yeah, I mean, it cares about that political control of Kiev, which I think probably Trump would be able to and willing to give. I'm not sure Biden would.
Yeah, well, that's a really cheerful answer as well. You're all doing very well. I am going to go to questions at some point. I just need to check when I'm supposed to end by. Matthias, do you know? Is there like a drop dead? 20 minutes. Okay, let me, before we get a question and answer, let me just ask one question to all of you about the sources. What is driving this? I mean, 2016, it seemed pretty clear to me that the two shoes to drop, Britain and the United States, had both gone from textbook good economics between 2008 and 2010, which is counter-cyclical Keynesian spending to make up for private sector saving, there was public sector dissaving. And then in 2010, both countries, Tea Party wins the midterm elections in the US, Cameron and Osborne come in with an austerity program in the UK, and 6 years later, essentially, they both ask their electorates, are you feeling okay? To which the answer is no. There seemed to be a pretty strong economic logic to the beginning of this populist distemper we are living through now. The worst, I think we agree, the worst threat, populist threat, is in the United States. There are problems this side of the Atlantic, but the United States is an order of magnitude greater threat on November the 5th. And yet America is the fastest growing post-pandemic economy, has been consistently, this time uninterrupted fiscal stimulus, arguably too much. But plenty of growth, inflation really not that high anymore, wage growth exceeding it for the last year or 18 months. And yet America is in the worst position. Can we explain that? And I'll ask each of you to answer this question, and then we'll go to audience questions. Yeah. Rory, you've been stateside for a while, on and off.
Well, I think fundamentally all these forms of populism are, whether in the US or Europe, are a rejection of the consensus of the 1990s and early 2000s. Fundamentally, people have lost faith in the sort of Thatcher-Reagan model of economics. They've lost faith in globalization. They've lost faith in a lot of the claims that liberal democracy can deliver prosperity. And they've lost faith in our ability to intervene successfully in the world. So the problems, I think, really are there by 2014. And they're there because of the 2008 financial crisis. It doesn't really matter. And this is where I differ from you. I don't think the key is that there were 2 years of great response. I think 2008 itself was a calamitous event that shook a lot of people's faith in the system. I think the rise of China broke something very important. I mean, from 1804 to 2004, we could draw a direct correlation between liberal democracy and economic prosperity. And from that moment onwards, there was this astonishingly dramatic example of a country. In 2004, the Chinese economy is still smaller than the British economy, right? 2005 becomes larger than the British economy, 2006 larger than the German economy, 2007 larger than the Japanese economy. And it doesn't do what the modernization theorists assumed, right? It doesn't become a liberal democracy. So that for a lot of the world, and this extends to our voters too, they begin to look at China, they begin to look at Saudi, they begin to look at UAE, and they begin to look at the paltry performance as far as they're concerned of their own government. So you're right, bit of a distinction between the US and Europe here, partly because the US is able to borrow in a way that Europe isn't. It's the world reserve currency, so it can do stuff that Europe can't do. But fundamentally, people's lives are not getting better. Ordinary people's lives are not getting better in the way that they would like. They may express it as a cost of living crisis, but it doesn't matter. I mean, you can see the spectacle of all these politicians trying to lecture people with macroeconomic statistics, right? Joe Biden will be saying, look what's happening to inflation, look what's happening to employment and growth. Rishi Sunak, even more comically, is trying the same thing, but people don't feel it. So I think it is that loss of faith in that fundamental model, in the sort of Francis Fukuyama dream that underlies all of this. And unless the technocratic center can begin to credibly suggest that they have an economic policy which is something more than a return to the 1970s, which is what it feels like, right? Effectively, it feels like people are giving up on free trade and now believe again in 1970s styles industrial strategies, right, which is not particularly inspiring, unless we have a sense that liberal democracy and human rights can deliver prosperity again. Then other factors that we haven't talked about, in particular, social media and the way in which AI and technology is going to begin to distort things in even weirder ways, is going to continue to provide opportunities for populists. It's a very, very bad time for Macron to call an election. It's a very bad time for Rishi Sunak to call an election. These people are foolish because it's a very, very bad time to be an incumbent. And I think that's what binds the US experience to the European experience.
Well, actually, what I'm going to say sort of fits perfectly to your point. The neoliberal consensus, right, which is sort of foundation of post-1990 modernization theory, and Francis Fukuyama's theory of global political entropy, convergence towards liberal democracy and liberal modernity, had one additional premise, which is very rarely discussed, which is that it was presumed that we could do without the state as a provider of public goods. And either very deliberately or inadvertently, the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the state was undermined, or state functions stripped out, on the assumption that this could be provided either by markets or by civil society. And I think that, to me, is what we're paying for right now, right? And it is what makes it so hard for politicians to do their job, right? Because state institutions quite literally aren't working. Whether that's Thames Water, right? Or in fact, Germans did very similar things, sold municipal utilities to Indonesia and that kind of thing. Now we've discovered their critical infrastructure and we need them back. That's just a sort of tangible example. But the theory of the decades after the 1990s was that we could all be consumers in a post-political, post-state, post-government world, right? And that things would be supplied by mechanisms other than the state. And I grant you, it was, I think what we've seen in the decades before that was sort of swings of the pendulum from sort of statism to sort of greater emphasis on free market. But my argument would be that in 1990, the pendulum swung out towards the neoliberal consensus and got stuck there, never came back. And the problem now is that we, despite a lot of people's best efforts at balkanizing globalization and the global economy, that doesn't really work. Interdependence continues apace, and it is actually quite hard to govern modern states under those conditions. But that, I think, is the challenge of the moment, right? And finding an equilibrium between markets, the state, and society, I think, is the challenge of the day. And the one person, if I might to finish on this note, the one person who saw this very, very early, and in fact wrote a book about it before he died, was Tony Judd, right? Ill Fares the Land, and which is, I would recommend, is worthwhile reading today.
So, Ed, I think there are three possible answers to this. The first is actually the most optimistic, and that is the economic argument. And what I mean by optimistic is that at least is an argument which says there's a connection between policy and politics. When policy screws up, you get bad politics. Yeah. When policy gets it right, that politics, there is a solution there. Actually, although we've been talking about Germany in kind of rather gloomy terms, in some respects, you could say that Germany is evidence of this. I mean, it's not as if the AfD has been on an upward surge, since 2014. It went up, and then it went down, and then went back up, yeah? And hey, there was a crisis that was not handled very well. That was the Eurozone crisis. That's when AfD emerged. We then went through years in which things looked like they were getting better. I think we actually handled the pandemic relatively well. And I would argue maybe even the first year of the war in Ukraine. Then, of course, that cost of living crisis started hitting. And hey, then you start getting nationalist populists back up. And then, of course, AfD, back up to more or less what it was polling in those years. So at least, there is a positive argument out there saying if you get that recipe right, there is a solution. Now, of course, and I think you rightly then mention the US, where it's like, well, that's obviously insufficient as an answer. And there you get into the second set of answers, which I think are obviously also right, which have to do with culture and identity and the magnifying effect of social media. And that's a much harder issue to grapple with, because how do you deal with that? How do you deal with it when the answer is not policy related? But that obviously has a lot of truth in it, and I think it probably plays a massive role in the United States. Arguably also, it explains more of the French story than possibly of the German story. So I think there's something in that space which is sort of far more worrying. And then I think there's a third that both Rory and Constanze were referring to, which has to do with how all of this then connects to that global picture. And actually, I think the argument that both were making is what connects these two explanations. Because indeed, if there is an idea, a fantasy, perhaps a truth, that there is an authoritarian populist mode of governance that can deliver good outcomes, perhaps you don't really know actually, how are the Chinese doing, yeah? But you have a fantasy that there is a more effective model of governance out there. And so I think it's what connects a lot of that cultural identity, that polarization, and attributes, to good or bad policy outcomes, not necessarily the actual meaning that they have.
Just a two-finger. Nathalie makes a really important point, and it is why the American hard right, for the first time in the history of the American right, is not a small government hard right, but a big government hard right. They are promising to do big spending on government projects, and that is a motif that you will find across the hard right now.
I wonder another time whether we should get into the story of Berlusconi, which sort of kind of ends well, right? So questions, and do we have a microphone for questioners? We do. So just say who you are and don't give a statement, ask a question. There's over the back row there, and then next to him.
Hi, Dana Allen, adjunct professor here and at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Sorry, you said no statement, but just one support of what I think Nathalie said, is that the difference between Trump pressing Ukraine for a deal and Biden pressing Ukraine for a deal is that when Biden does it, it's combined with implicit and explicit, security arrangements and long-term support, whereas Trump hates Ukraine, literally, for a lot of reasons that we should be familiar with. And so that's a huge difference. Can I just ask, though, a question? Nathalie, I had this crazy refrain in my mind that the party of Lincoln is a greater danger to democracy than the party of Mussolini. And a lot of what you were saying is that I was deluded in that I didn't see where Meloni would really go. But nonetheless, it seems to me what Constanze said, and I think what Ed said, are really important in that, the possible returning president of the United States is anti-constitutional, a criminal, is lawless and wants to destroy things. Whereas, you talk about values being threatened, and I accept that, but isn't it still within a sort of national constitutional and in fact a broader EU constitutional context, which should be slightly reassuring?
Dana, so the reason why I'm not reassured is firstly that I think that sometimes these things take time. Let's take Turkey as an example. Erdogan came to power in 2002. Up until 2007, we were talking about a democratic revolution in Turkey. So at times, you act according to a particular context. And in the case of Turkey, it took a number of years to do things that we thought were functional to democratization, i.e., kicking the military out from a political role, but actually were functional to a project of centralization of power. So first thing is things can take time. My second observation is, what does whatever fascism mean in the 21st century? Well, I think it has certain features to it, yeah? So I think there is something that falls into the category of personality cult, centralization of power, nationalism, social conservatism on issues of civil rights and migration. So I think, tick, 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 tick. When it comes to now, you can then express those things more or less depending on time passing or constraints. It may be that she will still be constrained. Yeah, it may be that Biden is re-elected. It may be that the French somehow miraculously fall into place. A number of things could happen that will keep the constraints on. And of course, there's the constraint that I was mentioning earlier. The debt. So she will have to, take care not to sort of ruffle feathers in markets too much. And it could be that she runs to Washington to kiss Trump's ring in the case that he is elected. And he said, hang on a sec there, weren't you the one that was kissed by, yeah? And how much is it that you spend on defense? So it could be, yeah, that there is an attempt to go in a certain direction and it doesn't work out. And in that scenario, yes, she will still behave. But if the fundamental question is, given the opportunity, will someone like that try? I have no doubts whatsoever that the answer is yes.
Just to reinforce a very point that would be obvious to everyone in the room, which is that the power of the Prime Minister of Italy is so much less than the power of the President of France, that if Marine Le Pen becomes the President of France, the impact, because the French Constitution on France and the impact on the European Union will be much, much more profound. Yeah.
John, Professor Farrell, Dr. Farrell.
So I just wanted to very quickly pick up on something that Constanze said, which I think is really important, about how it is that the the far right, have a theory of the state and how the state can be effective, and how it is that liberals do not at the moment, how it is that liberals over a few decades more or less went for the Hayekian assumption that if you had to deal with big complex problems, you sent them out to the market. I think that there are stirrings intellectually of a liberal theory of the state. Here, Dan Davis's book, which The Unaccountability Machine, which got 2 write-ups in the FT today, I was delighted to see. Also, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's forthcoming book on a liberalism that builds. But I just wanted to put that to really reinforce that I think what Constanze is saying is incredibly important, and that we need to have politicians as well as thinkers really try to explore how it is that the state can actually do things, how it is that the state can solve problems, because if we don't have that vision, we're basically ceding ground to the people who we don't want to cede ground to.
My answer to that is that Professor Farrell is a very good man.
Yes, he is, and that was a very, very cleverly disguised question. Was there a question? It was a very good short comment. Yes, Matthias.
Thank you. Great panel. Question for Constanze. Do you see any conditions under which there's a functioning Franco-German engine for Europe in the next 2 years? And question for Nathalie. If Trump gets elected and does stop support for Ukraine, he can just say it, right? Do you see the dominoes falling in Europe as well? And then that being kind of the sign in the East Asian, in the Pacific theater for especially China, that the West really is useless when it comes to this, and that this could really trigger something bigger? Or are there conditions under which the European Union actually does somehow come up with continued support at least through 2025 or something like this?
Well, I think at this point it's a given, right, that the RN wins these elections, right? We're assuming that. And I'm going to say that the likelihood of the coalition muddling through is still a bit larger than 50%. So no. Yeah. And even if it weren't, I think a conservative-led German government would have a very hard time working with Marine Le Pen. And so but then again, I would also say, I think it's past time to put, or let me put it this way, the Franco-German motor thing hasn't been working for a long time. The problem is really slightly, I think you have to describe it a little differently, which is that if the French or the German, if there is no French or no German leadership, then things don't really happen, right? Manuel, you hosted me in Madrid a couple months ago, and you gave a very nice lunch. And you will remember the conversation when somebody from the policy-making world said, we were so annoyed at Macron, we told him not to give these speeches, and he still gives them, and we can't stand him, and it's just makes us so angry. And I said, I find that, frankly, very disappointing, because if you don't like what the French and the Germans are doing, for which I think you would have eminent reasons, then why don't you come with your own visions of Europe? Why isn't Warsaw, Madrid, Lisbon, Tallinn, Stockholm coming with their own visions of Europe? There is every space for you to do so, right? And it is I am frankly deeply underwhelmed, right, by people who say, but Paris, but Berlin, right? This is a real moment of crisis which could destroy the European Union, or it could refound it. And I would quite frankly like to see everybody participating here, including the Brits. I don't care whether you're in or out. You've got a role to play.
Nathalie, and then Rory, you can respond to that, Nathalie.
So I think there's a question that has to do with ability and a question that has to do with will. Ability, I would say, better than what we were doing up until a year ago, where the assumption was that, mind you, the United States as well, when the assumption was that this would be a short war, and so we hadn't really clicked in terms of defense industry and production. That realization came kind of almost 2 years late, but it happened. And so, by the time we get to January next year, if the US were to drop out entirely, it would still be a big loss, but not as big as it would be if it happened now, and certainly not as big as had it happened before. But then the real question, which I think you're getting at, is that of political will. Now, if we had the governments that we have today in power, then I would say that actually there is a critical mass not in support, but that has realized amongst those governing today, not everyone, but a critical mass that has realized that Ukraine's security is integral to European security. And so if we imagined a situation in which by the time we get to February, January of next year, these governments will still be in power, I would be fairly confident. But of course, the problem is, and the conversation that we've been having is that that's not guaranteed at all. And in fact, it's quite unlikely. And so I think that the question of the lack of political will has and is intimately connected to this question of what is the future of democracy in some of these major countries. It doesn't mean that they all need to fall off, yeah, but again, it's a question of critical mass. If you have, you know, Germany, whatever, you know, fall of a government because they can't agree on a budget. If you have France, Italy at this point will be happy to tag on. That is where it crumbles.
Rory, just, I mean, Constanze wasn't being flip. I think Macron has tried to get Britain involved in a European political community vis-a-vis Ukraine, which put Brexit into the shade, right? We all agree, or at least non-populists kind of agree in Europe, that Ukraine is a serious challenge, and Britain and France are on the same page.
Yes, I mean, I think that the problem, though, is that the politics in Britain, as in many, many other countries in the world, is not very favorable towards international intervention. So there's very little talk about foreign policy in this election. Labour, Keir Starmer has shied off making the 2.5% commitment on defence expenditure. And, you know, Europe's defence budget and defence situation is pretty dismal. I mean, Europe without the US does not look good. And we pat ourselves on the back and we're increasing spending. But the truth of the matter is, if you actually look at our ability to coordinate our military and the type of equipment that we have, it's not a viable challenge to Russia. And the problem that I'm facing, I mean, just to sort of maybe answer your bigger question about dominoes, I'm not imagining a world in which we can predict at the moment that we're sort of, this is Hitler going to the Czech Republic or going to Czechoslovakia. It feels more, though, as though what we're entering is a world with a potential degradation of our constitutional systems, a dramatic shift in liberal values, and perfectly plausibly, regardless of what one thinks about whether Putin is moving into Moldova or whether they're going to have a go at the Baltic, I think you can expect Serbia to make moves against northern Kosovo and Republika Srpska. You can expect Azerbaijan to make aggressive moves towards Armenia. So it'll be that kind of fragmentation that I would anticipate over the next 2 years rather than a world war. Yeah.
Oh, I'm feeling so cheerful. Yes, the lady there. We need an Aperol Spritzer, but not yet. We've got to earn it in the audience.
Thank you so much. I'm Dipali Mukhopadhyay at SAIS. I'm wondering if the conclusion of this conversation is that a new article of the end of history needs to be written, in which is what you're saying, that populist authoritarianism is the outcome to which everyone is sort of sliding. And I wonder, to Rory's point, can you talk a bit about the implications of that? Sometimes it feels like there's a conversation about what's happening in the West in its own countries that's totally divorced from arguments about the West championing things like liberal democracy, or whether it's Ukraine or Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. Is that whole world order also at stake in what happens in these particular domestic sites? Or are there actually opportunities for other countries, like we mentioned the Indian election, to move into that and reframe things a bit?
Well, maybe we can bring the Indian election into the answer here. But Rory, you were name-checked, but all of you feel free to answer. That's a very important, larger context.
I think the idea of the global order is in real trouble. There is very little appetite from voters in many countries, including the United States, for the old vision of the liberal global order. And that is partly because we went from the apparent successes of Bosnia, Kosovo, Liberia, Sierra Leone in the 90s to the body blow humiliations of Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, these are $3.5 trillion wars, $3,500 billion. We literally enter Afghanistan to topple a Taliban government. We spent 20 years there. We give the country back to the Taliban. Right? You don't need to be a populist to say this implies a foreign policy elite that was out of its mind. And there is no way at all that China or India or any of the emerging countries wish to play those kinds of roles in the world or stand up for that kind of order. Instead, what we're seeing is, for example, in Libya, in Somalia, in Sudan, this very odd phenomenon of countries such as UAE, Qatar, Turkey, suddenly making the running. Proxy wars of a very odd sort coming out of these sort of middling powers increasingly emerging. So, no, I think almost regardless of where we go with our constitutional order, our values, our economic system, I think we're in a world well beyond a stable liberal global order now.
So let me come at this question from a slightly different angle. I earlier said I'm a lawyer. I also used to be a journalist, and my journalistic career spans basically Rwanda to Afghanistan. I was in Rwanda, I was in the Balkans, I was in Afghanistan. I covered the war crimes tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and I covered the creation of the International Criminal Court. And all those moments, right, were the kind of thing that if the convergence theory had been true, weren't going to happen anymore. Couldn't have possibly have happened. And to witness them, and then to later witness the trial, was to get an education in what human beings can do to each other. Don't really need that as a German, but it was an update, as it were. And I will say that I still think that, flawed as many of our Western-led humanitarian interventions were, they did save a lot of lives. They did actually end wars and conflicts. And I, for one, was glad to see the war crime, not just the tribunals, but the convictions of some of the perpetrators. And I think we will come to regret a time where that is no longer possible. And I'll leave you to two things. We are currently seeing a horrific war in Sudan, and with all the potential of another genocide. And we're seeing an international criminal court suddenly becoming very, very active on the subject of Israel-Palestine and against sort of Western hegemony, right? We are seeing, in other words, a real shift of the sort of international legal order at the same time that we're seeing I think, the crumbling of the theory that would be possible to end the use of force and to prevent the most horrific crimes against humanity. I don't quite know where that's heading, right? But I think we may come to miss the 1990s, paradoxically.
So I think, so it's clear that we no longer live in, let's call it the open world, the liberal international order and all the rest of it, the world that we regret. I think it would be wrong to conclude that therefore we live in a closed world. So I think that the story here is one of, in a sense, openness and closure coexisting. It's a story of interdependence being both a source of prosperity and a source of insecurity. It's a story of democracy having the seed within it of authoritarianism, but also when that authoritarianism seems to prevail. I mean, again, we didn't talk about India, but India indeed is an example. It can actually be rowed backwards, yeah, or Poland for that matter, yeah. It can be challenged. It's a world in which actually, we've been talking about multipolarity. It's actually non-polar in many respects, in which you have the West that at times stands with the global majority, actually Ukraine. Let's think about votes in the UN General Assembly. And then it ends up, think about Gaza, in a shrinking minority, precisely when it doesn't actually, or it's seen as not living up to its own values. So I think it's really a world of contradiction, which is why we're having so much trouble in making sense of it. And it may be that those contradictions are there because it's not a steady state. Or it may be that this is the new steady state, or perhaps it will be for the rest of our lifetimes.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, the lady there, the woman there in front of.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I actually wanted to follow up on that point of we're forgetting the rest here. I mean, we're talking about our miseries, which I fully agree with, but not that there aren't any among those other countries which are not following our model. There's lots of discontent there, which we shouldn't forget. And this goes all the way to China. People aren't happy in China at the moment. And we may not see it because it's just a different, the degree of transparency isn't there. But that doesn't mean that other models are perceived as superior. Maybe it's just a question of who allows the system to show its weaknesses more clearly. Yeah?
Is this another cleverly disguised question?
Yes, I end there. I'm just saying that, yes, we can cry here as much as we want, but I think we also need to see that problems do exist in other models, and that at the end of the day, it would be a question. I mean, this thing is not going to end tomorrow. We're not going to all go to authoritarianism just because our model doesn't work, because that doesn't work either. It seems by what we are seeing. That's all.
I agree fully with your question. The gentleman there, sorry, and two very, very quick ones, and then the lady in front, machine
just
gun
a comment.
kind of
I know that time is short. I was not prepared to ask questions, but to listen, to learn. But I cannot help to say this, that the collective West used to be the provider for solutions, for answers to the rest of the world. But now, the collective West is a problem itself, for whatever reason you discussed. But still, consciously, subconsciously, you still see this as our world, our global order. But actually, you're very, very close to yourself. It's inclusive, it's a club. You refuse to look outside. You refuse to enhance yourself outside this club, say from a higher level to say, as Alicia said, this is a minority, an extremely more and more minority, but consciously, subconsciously, you refuse to say from other people's perspective. There's old saying in China saying that you don't see the mountain because you are in the mountain. Why don't you just put outside a little bit? So this is very kind of strange to me, because we have a much larger question there, the environmental issue, for example. We have AI coming to us. We have no idea how to control its development. We have all those issues, but now we're so, I would say, a little bit pessimistic. Our problem, but if you invite people from other part of the world, a very large part of the world, to ask them for their opinion, say, why? What's your opinion? Why we, the most advanced society, could end up like this? And maybe we can have some answers.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the title of this panel was sort of internal looking. Last question. Oh no, there's another question. I mean, oh yes. I mean, I like questions.
Respecting the title of this particular panel, which was inward looking, just want to ask the panel the question that does it appear to you sometimes that as you are immersed in many countries, and all of that has been said enough, in the implosion that is happening and the state of unpeace that is also local and also international, that the rest of the world is watching you digress from all the values that you taught the rest of the world. We talked about protectionism, whether it's trade, so whether it's human rights. So when the ICC does something where it is to a partner of the West, then it is to be qualified and to be followed. And when the UN General Assembly votes for something which is a partner of the West, then it's supposed to be qualified and followed, and not when it goes against. So the rest of the world is right now looking at the West and looking at them not being very democratic or very globally trade-oriented and pretty much moving away. And Rory mentioned very well $3.3 trillion. The Watson Institute of the Brown University tells you also that there were 32 million people who have been displaced after the post 9/11 wars, and there are 800,000 people who died because. So there has been a human cost that the rest of the world has been watching of these wars, which didn't go that well. And could that? So does that at all concern you? That as you are sort of very concerned about what's happening inside, the rest of the world is watching your behavior, and pretty much writing off many of the values that it was talking
And I think we did have a final question that will add to that and collect them.
So I wanted to go back to this question about whether the decline, the problem in our societies is the economy or whether it's identity. When I look at Germany, I look at Eastern Germany, there is an economic convergence story, but there is a real identity issue. When I look at France, 40% of the voters of Rassemblement National are Sarkozy former voters. It's just that they don't like the France where they live. They think it's a France in decline. There is a France that does not represent the social conservatism that they now feel has been lost in society. So we kind of know how to deal with the economic piece. And I think we've got lots of great ideas about how to regulate and how the state can intervene and how to boost competitiveness, but how do we deal with the identity issue? Because that is a much harder story to deal with.
Okay, there's several questions in there and two very good comments. Each of you, should we start with you, Nathalie? Each of you gets 30 seconds, maybe 45 if I'm feeling tolerant. Should I start with you, Rory? Or Nathalie, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I think on the very important sort of navel gazing question, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That is indeed the tendency. I think in some respects, whereas once upon a time, when we were in a moment of strength, it was a navel gazing as in we are the world, that kind of navel gazing. I think now it's, there is a relative decline and oh my God, we've got so many problems and therefore we need to focus on them. But however, I do think that the problem, and I think Ed, you were referring to it earlier, the problem is that we may be navel gazing, but so is everyone else. And so in many respects, in this kind of non-polar world, it's kind of no one's world. No one is solving the Sudans of this world, yeah? No one is solving anything. And this is, I think, part of the predicament that we're in. The second thing that I'll say on the regression is, I think, if you take the story of the last few years, especially of the last 3 years, I would say, well, okay, the war in Ukraine began and we realized that there was kind of a rest of the world out there that we needed to reach out to, but we were on, indeed, we were living up to our values and it was about international law and all the rest of it. And if you take, G7 has just concluded, if you take the German G7, that was the first G7 that really made a big effort in inviting the South Africas and the Senegals and the Indonesias and the Indias. There was this attempt of reaching out, especially to, the sort of, democracies in the global South. And that was a story. Then you kind of move on, and then of course the Middle East happens. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, had the Middle East not happened, I think we would be in a far stronger position than we are now to doing that outreach. I think, frankly speaking, what has been happening in the Middle East has totally destroyed our credibility in doing that kind of thing that we understood 3 years ago that we had to start doing more.
All right, I'm going to be the odd person out here and take some issue with this. I go back 30 years covering human rights stories as a journalist and then writing about interventions and war crimes tribunals and so on. And can I just say that while the West very often violates its own principles, at least it has principles, okay? I would like to see some non-Western governments try and live up to this kind of principles a little more. We have spent billions on development. We have done a lot of good things in the world, I think. And yes, we violate our principles. Yes, we are hypocrites. But you know what? At least we have standards, right? It's the same, this is the same structural argument, right? With the same discussion that we were having earlier, which is, why aren't the French and the Germans running the European Union? And everybody else saying, yeah, you've got to do this, we'll sit back. I'm sorry, that's not how it works anymore. Not in this world, right? I think that it is time for other regions of the world to step up. If you want things to change, well, come up with your own visions, right? Talk to us about it. And honestly, I have spent a lot of time traveling outside of the West as a journalist and as a think tanker, engaging with people, and so have we all. It is not correct that we have not tried to engage. right? And I do also think I would find this whole Israel-Gaza discussion a little more plausible if I heard more condemnation of what happened on October 7th in the non-Western world. And I'm sorry, I mean, in other words, I take your point, but I'm also pushing back.
I think that the tragedy that we face is that the West did a lot of harm and was very hypocritical, but the West's increasing withdrawal and isolation, signaled by Obama's failure to hold red lines in Syria, signaled by Biden's catastrophic decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, did not make the world a more peaceful place. In fact, since 2014, as the West has become more isolationist, every year since then, we have seen more internally displaced people, more refugees, more civilians killed in conflict. The number of democracies around the world has begun to fall very fast. And in this conversation, we are not talking about Africa at all. 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria by 2050. 40% of the world's population will be African by the end of this century. We have just had, in just over a year, 7 pro-Western, pro-American elected governments in Africa disappear, replaced by military coups and a shift towards, broadly speaking, pro-Russian governments, right? And our international development budgets, which we boasted of, indeed, and we try to make poverty history, have been cut around the world very, very dramatically. The US is currently carrying about 85 to 92% of the humanitarian burden in most of the extreme humanitarian emergencies because Germany is not stepping up, France is not stepping up, Britain is not stepping up. So I think we're in a very tragic situation where the West's withdrawal has not made the world a better place. But I do not believe in this rhetoric of people need to step up, because I think it's extraordinarily unrealistic. When Trump says Europe needs to step up in NATO, they're not going to. When we say Poland and Sweden need to take the role of Germany and France, they're not going to. When we imagine that Saudi and China and India are somehow going to replace the role of the United States, they're not going to. And lost in this whole situation is the fact that in Africa, we've gone from 150 million people in extreme poverty in 1980 to 470 million people in extreme poverty in Africa today. And there's nobody really leading a program to address those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, with the broaden horizon and feel even more suicidal, but I mean, it's a very, very, very good final set of questions and interventions. Thank you very much to all the panelists, to the audience, really wide-ranging, very thought-provoking. I really enjoyed it. Well, I learned a lot from it. Thank you, and I guess now, what should I tell people to do something? Drinks. Yeah, I knew there was a magic word. Drink.
Support for Ukrainian refugees. So in practice, in almost all these